The medieval justice system, often seen through a sanitized lens in modern history books, was anything but fair and impartial. It was a system built on a delicate balance of power, superstition, and a relentless pursuit of control. Imagine living in an era where your very life could be decided not by a jury of peers but by the whims of a local lord, or perhaps the king himself. It was a time when justice wasn't about rights, fairness, or the rule of law. It was about dominance, influence, and the brutal enforcement of order. In the absence of a centralized authority, like the police forces we know today, power was distributed in strange and often unsettling ways. Each village, town, and city had its own set of rules, enforced by barons, lords, or kings who saw themselves as the ultimate arbiters of right and wrong. The concept of law was fluid, with each ruler interpreting it in their own way. The law was not something abstract or universal. It was the tool of whoever held power. What was deemed a crime in one town might go unpunished in another, and what seemed like a minor offense could lead to a brutal, often irreversible punishment. Power in medieval society wasn't just political, it was deeply intertwined with religion. The church, ever present and ever looming, had its own legal system that governed the lives of all who lived under its gaze. The clergy often acted as judges, wielding their influence over cases that involved spiritual offences, and there was little distinction between the earthly and the divine. A crime could be seen not just as a violation of a local law, but as an offence against God. Heresy, for example, was considered a sin against both God and the king, with consequences far worse than anything a secular ruler could impose. Punishments, then, were not only for maintaining order, they were viewed as divine retribution, often merciless and inescapable. But the mystery runs deeper. For all its brutality, the medieval justice system was wrapped in layers of superstition and fear. It wasn't just that a wrongdoer could be punished. It was that the very concept of crime and punishment was often obscured by dark rituals and strange beliefs. Trials by ordeal, such as the infamous trial by fire or water, were not uncommon. These were methods believed to reveal the truth, but in reality, they were cruel tests of endurance and suffering. The idea was that God would intervene to protect the innocent, but in practice, these trials were an exercise in fear and superstition. Those who survived by some miracle or some misfortune were often considered innocent, and those who didn't, well, they were guilty in the eyes of both man and God. It was a system where the line between justice and terror was incredibly thin. The question then arises, how did such a system evolve? How did it become so deeply embedded in the fabric of medieval life, shaping not just the lives of commoners but the very nature of power itself? What if the very justice that was meant to protect you could just as easily sentence you to a horrifying death? From this dark, fragmented world of medieval law, we now begin to unravel the twisted mechanics of how it all worked, how justice was dispensed with terrifying consequences, and how it was used not just to punish, but to control. In the medieval world, the church was far more than a place of worship. It was the very fabric of society, intertwining religious, social, and political life in a way that gave it unparalleled influence over the lives of the people. For those living under its dominion, the line between divine will and earthly law was not easily drawn. The church's power stretched far beyond the pulpit and into the courtroom, where ecclesiastical courts were the ultimate arbiters of moral and legal decisions. These courts wielded significant authority, often making final judgments that had life-altering consequences. The church's legal system, distinct from secular law, governed spiritual matters, those involving sin, heresy, and blasphemy. But this wasn't just a matter of guiding the souls of the faithful. It was about control. It was the church that decided what constituted sin, and by extension, it was the church that decided who was innocent or guilty in the eyes of God. Heresy, for instance, wasn't just seen as a religious violation, it was a societal crime. Denying the teachings of the church was an offense so grave that it could lead to torture, imprisonment, or even death. In a world where faith was everything, the fear of crossing the church was far greater than any fear of secular punishment. Trials for heresy could be public spectacles, intended not only to punish, but to serve as a terrifying reminder to the populace of the power the church held. One of the most infamous examples of the church's legal authority was the Inquisition. An entire machinery of clerical investigators and judges was devoted to rooting out perceived threats to the faith. The accused, often accused on the flimsiest of evidence, could find themselves subjected to grueling torture, forced confessions, and lifelong excommunication. And what was the crime they were charged with? Simply believing something different, challenging the established order, or questioning the divine interpretation handed down by the Church. But it wasn't only the threat of heresy that loomed large. The Church also had the power to excommunicate. This act was more than a spiritual punishment. It was a social death sentence. To be excommunicated was to be cut off from the community, from God's grace, and from the promise of salvation. Entire villages could be thrown into turmoil when one of their own was cast out by the Church, as people feared the eternal consequences of being associated with a damned soul. And the effect was immediate. Without the Church's blessing, one's property could be seized, family members might be ostracized, and the prospect of salvation in the afterlife would be lost forever. Could a single word from the Pope turn your life into a nightmare? The answer was yes. But the reach of the Church's justice didn't stop there. Witch hunts, driven by both fear and fervour, took root during this period, fueled by the Church's insistence that witches were working in league with the devil. Accusations could be made with little to no evidence, and entire communities were swept up in hysteria. Women, in particular, were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, often because they defied societal expectations or were simply unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And once accused, their fates were sealed. Trials were less about evidence and more about confession, with the threat of torture hanging over every word. In this dark world where the power of the Church loomed large, religion was not just a path to salvation. It was the very thing that governed your life. Every action, every word, every thought was under its scrutiny. And the price for disobedience was more than just social isolation. It could mean a swift and brutal end. Yet, even as the Church held this tremendous power, the secular world was not without its own forms of justice, often even more terrifying. While the Church dictated matters of the soul, local lords and monarchs ruled over the bodies of the people, with their own, sometimes far more violent, interpretations of justice. In the shadow of the towering castles and fortresses that dotted the medieval landscape, the local lords held absolute power. Within their realms, they were the final word in matters of justice, and their decisions could determine the very fate of their subjects. A lord's will was law, and there was no higher authority to appeal to. To live under such power meant that your life could be altered in an instant by a word, a gesture, or the faintest suspicion. What did it mean to be judged by a lord who saw your life as expendable? Unlike the centralized judicial systems of later centuries, the medieval world was fragmented into hundreds of tiny fiefdoms, each ruled by a lord with near unlimited authority. For the common people who lived under these lords, the rule of law was less a guarantee of justice and more a game of chance, where survival often depended on the whim of the man in charge. The lord could imprison, torture, or execute without explanation, and the very concept of a fair trial was often irrelevant. There were no lawyers to plead your case, no jury of your peers to judge your fate. Justice was swift and final, and its methods were gruesome. One of the most chilling aspects of this medieval system was the widespread use of torture. Torture was not an unfortunate byproduct of the justice system, it was an integral tool. The goal was not just to punish, but to extract confessions, regardless of guilt or innocence. This could happen in the most public of settings, in the town square, where the sounds of suffering were intended to serve as both punishment and warning to others. But there was another, darker aspect of medieval justice, one that often took place far from prying eyes, under the cover of night. This was the justice of the Lord, delivered in secret, in the dead of night, where the accused had little chance of defending themselves. It was in these hidden corners that some of the most horrific punishments took place. Lords who ruled over their lands with absolute power could take justice into their own hands with terrifying ease. Torture chambers existed within castles, and those unlucky enough to be accused of a crime could find themselves hauled away in the dead of night, never to be seen again. There were no public trials, no attempts at fairness. The Lord's decision was final, and often that decision meant unimaginable pain. For some, this was a fate worse than death. One of the most notorious examples of this was the use of the rack. This simple but effective torture device could stretch the human body to its limits, causing excruciating pain and often breaking bones or dislocating joints. It was used to extract confessions, often under threat of further mutilation or death. The pain could go on for hours, leaving the victim with little choice but to comply with whatever the Lord demanded. And it didn't end there. Once the confession was obtained, the accused might be sentenced to a public execution, the culmination of their torment. These executions were not done quietly. They were events meant to display the power of the Lord and remind the people of the fate that awaited those who defied his will. Public executions were designed to be spectacles of terror. People gathered to witness the death of a criminal, often at the hands of the executioner, who could be just as feared as the Lord himself. Whether it was the slow, agonizing process of hanging, or the brutal cleaving of a head from its body with a sword, the scene was not one of mercy, but of total dominance. The message was clear: defy the law, and you would meet a gruesome end. These events were not just about punishment, they were a tool of control, a means of instilling fear into the hearts of the population. The Lord's word was absolute, and the people knew that to resist could mean their lives. But what happened when the crime was something even the Lord couldn't easily justify, something so beyond the pale that it threatened the very stability of the realm? Even then, the Lord had ways of dealing with it. Many lords maintained their own personal executioners, men who were trained in the arts of inflicting pain and delivering death with a chilling efficiency. These men were often feared as much as the lords themselves, for they were the ones who carried out the orders, no questions asked. And for those who were accused of crimes considered especially heinous, the Lord could always invoke the darkest of punishments: death by fire, death by boiling, or even being drawn and quartered. These methods, which seemed to defy all reason, were designed not just to end a life, but to annihilate the very soul of the person. The body was mutilated, disfigured, and destroyed in ways that left little room for remembrance. But it wasn't just the criminals who lived in fear. The common people, caught in the machinery of justice, could feel the weight of the Lord's anger even for minor offences. A simple disagreement could turn into a matter of life and death if the Lord decided that the law had been broken. Once accused, a person's fate was often sealed. Justice was unpredictable. One might find themselves at the mercy of a lenient Lord who believed in fairness, or at the mercy of a tyrant who believed in nothing but his own power. In either case, there was no real protection for the people. There were no safeguards, no guarantees that the law would be upheld. In such a world, a man's life could be worth nothing more than a fleeting moment in a lord's brutal exercise of power. This system of midnight justice, as it came to be known, bred a deep sense of fear and uncertainty among the people. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was the absence of mercy. It was in these quiet, secret moments that the true brutality of medieval law came to life. A system where the powerful held the reins and the powerless could only pray they would never fall victim to the whims of the Lord. The line between justice and cruelty was blurred beyond recognition, and for those living in this world, survival was the only real form of justice. As the story of medieval justice unfolds, it becomes clear that this brutal system of law was not confined to the local lord's realm. Even the kings and monarchs who ruled over vast kingdoms had their own forms of justice, and these too could be terrifyingly arbitrary. But that, as we will see, was another layer to the dark heart of medieval justice, one that operated on an even more dangerous scale. In the stillness of the night, when the rest of the world lay asleep, justice was often meted out in the shadows. The practice of nighttime trials and executions was a chilling hallmark of medieval law, one that kept the public in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. The secrecy of these midnight events wasn't just a logistical convenience, it was an intentional tool used to intimidate and control the people. Under the cover of darkness, trials could be held in secret, away from the prying eyes of the public, preventing any scrutiny or interference. It was a time when the law was not something to be questioned, but something to be feared. Would you confess under the torture of a shadowy executioner in the dead of night? At these secretive trials, there were no lawyers, no debates about guilt or innocence. The accused were often left in ignorance, not knowing the charge against them until the moment they were called to answer. The Lord or his appointed officials acted as judge, jury, and executioner, their decisions made without the oversight of a larger court. The only thing that mattered was the word of those in power, and if you were accused, your fate was often sealed before you even stepped into the darkened courtroom. If a confession was needed, it was not sought through reason or mercy. Instead, the tools of torture were employed, tools designed not just to extract information, but to break the will of the accused, to force them into submission. The breaking wheel was one of the most infamous instruments of medieval torture, a symbol of the era's brutality. A victim would be strapped to a large wooden wheel, limbs splayed and bent, often for hours on end, as the executioner worked to inflict pain. The wheel's purpose wasn't just to inflict pain, but to make the criminal's body a grotesque display of suffering, as if to say, "This is what happens when you defy the law." And all the while, the accused would be forced to endure, with the only chance for release being a confession often extracted under unbearable pain. The rack was another instrument that came to symbolize the harshness of medieval justice. This cruel device would stretch the body of the accused, pulling and twisting their limbs until they were dislocated, often causing permanent damage. The goal was simple: break the victim physically and mentally until they had no choice but to comply. Torture, in the medieval world, was not about finding the truth, it was about forcing a response, and that response was often a false confession, simply to end the agony. But the horrors didn't stop with torture. If the confession was deemed satisfactory, the next step was the execution. Often, these executions took place in the dead of night, again shielded from the public. The executioner, a shadowy figure who moved in silence, was tasked with delivering the final blow. The methods of execution varied, from hanging to beheading to more grotesque forms of death like the breaking wheel or burning at the stake. But no matter the method, the act was meant to be a spectacle, a warning to others of the consequences of breaking the law. These midnight executions were not just about punishment, they were about power. The lord or the king wielded their authority in these moments, reminding the people that they were not safe, that no one was beyond reach. The darkness, the secrecy, the brutality, all of it was designed to reinforce the idea that the law was absolute and that defying it meant facing a terrifying end. Fear, more than justice, was the true currency of the medieval legal system. As the midnight trials and executions continued, they became an integral part of the medieval justice system, cementing the idea that law and punishment were inseparable. But as we move forward in time, we begin to see a shift slowly. The monarchy began to consolidate power, and the chaotic, fear-driven methods of justice would evolve. Monarchs sought to build more formalized legal systems, replacing the unpredictable violence of the past with something resembling a more structured form of justice. But the echoes of the midnight executions, the shadows that haunted the medieval legal landscape, would continue to shape the laws and the power structures that emerged in their wake. As the medieval world began to shift from small, localized fiefdoms to larger, more centralized kingdoms, so too did the nature of justice. For centuries, the law had been a tool wielded by lords and religious authorities, each with their own interpretation of right and wrong, often determined by personal whim or political gain. But as monarchies grew in power, the chaos of this decentralized system could no longer sustain the needs of expanding kingdoms. The rise of kings and queens marked the beginning of a profound transformation, one in which justice would no longer be a matter of local power, but would be centralized under the authority of the crown. What happens when the law is no longer in the hands of a cruel lord, but a king who rules from a throne? This was the question that began to shape the landscape of medieval justice, as monarchs sought to impose order on a chaotic world. As the feudal system gradually gave way to more unified kingdoms, the ability to mete out justice began to shift from the barons and local lords to the throne. Kings, recognizing that the whims of individual rulers were not enough to govern a growing population, began to establish centralized systems that would allow them to maintain control over all aspects of law and order. But this transition was not without its challenges. The idea of centralized judicial power was a direct threat to the local lords, who had long ruled with absolute authority within their domains. For centuries, these lords had enjoyed near total control over their territories, and the idea of losing that power was not one they embraced willingly. The shift from feudal autonomy to monarchical rule led to a series of political struggles, as monarchs and local authorities clashed over the right to administer justice. One of the most pivotal moments in this shift came during the reign of King Henry II of England in the 12th century. Henry sought to consolidate his authority by establishing a more structured legal system. His reforms included the creation of royal courts and the establishment of circuit judges, officials who travelled the kingdom to hear cases and impose the law in places where local lords had previously been the sole arbiters. Henry's aim was to standardize justice and bring it under royal control, making the system more uniform and reducing the influence of the unpredictable, often arbitrary rule of the barons. This was a clear attempt to reduce the power of the feudal system and create a legal framework that could function across the entire kingdom. But Henry's reforms were met with resistance, not only from the local lords who feared losing their power, but also from the church, which had long held sway over ecclesiastical law. Church leaders, who had enjoyed significant influence over the lives of the people, were reluctant to relinquish their authority in favour of secular rulings. The struggle between the monarchy and the church would play out over centuries, with conflicts like the famous dispute between Henry II and Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, marking the tension between royal and ecclesiastical control over justice. The conflict wasn't just political, it was deeply cultural too. For the people of the time, the shift from local, often brutal justice to a centralized legal system was a sign of both hope and fear. On one hand, centralized rule promised more consistency, more order, and less unpredictability. On the other, it also meant that justice was no longer in the hands of the local community but in the hands of a distant monarch whose decisions could seem just as arbitrary and detached as the lords who had come before him. The transition from feudal justice to monarchical rule set the stage for a new era in legal history, one where the idea of law as a system based on reason and fairness would begin to take root. But the road to that more rational system was anything but smooth. The monarchy's attempt to consolidate power would be a long and contested process, one that would see further struggles and reforms, but it was the beginning of a shift that would eventually lead to the development of modern legal systems. From this growing centralization of power, we can now move to the specific reforms introduced by the monarchs of the time, who began to formalize the law and replace the chaotic, personal justice of earlier centuries with more structured, rational legal principles. As monarchs increasingly consolidated power, the medieval justice system slowly began to evolve from its chaotic, arbitrary roots into something more structured and systematic. The age of law, dictated by local lords and religious authorities, was slowly giving way to the idea of law as something that could be codified, standardized, and applied consistently across the kingdom. But this transformation wasn't swift, nor was it without its challenges. It would take centuries for the idea of justice to become more than just a tool of control, and even then, the process would be slow, fraught with resistance, and marked by conflict. Could the law ever be truly fair after centuries of darkness? The first step in this monumental shift was the creation of royal courts, a move that was as much about consolidating royal authority as it was about administering justice. Monarchs, recognizing the need for a more reliable and uniform system of law, began to establish courts that were directly under the crown's control. These royal courts were designed to replace the erratic system of local tribunals and lord-run courts. It was no longer enough for a lord to act as judge, jury, and executioner in his own domain. The monarchs realized that justice needed to be more centralized, available to all subjects, regardless of their lord's power or influence. A key feature of this centralization was the rise of common law, a system of law that was based on judicial decisions rather than statutes or edicts. This was a revolutionary step because it allowed for consistency in legal matters, with decisions made by judges setting precedents that could guide future rulings. In theory, common law meant that similar cases would be treated similarly, regardless of who the judge was or where the trial took place. This was a major break from the arbitrary, personalized justice that had been the hallmark of the feudal era, and it laid the foundation for modern legal systems that still rely on precedent today. The creation of a more consistent legal system also meant that the role of the judiciary began to grow in importance. Judges were no longer just functionaries who recorded the decisions of kings or lords. They became active participants in shaping the law. The notion that law could be based on reason and fairness, not just the will of the powerful, began to take hold, and the idea of judicial independence started to take shape. But this was not a universally accepted notion. Local barons, who had grown accustomed to their unchecked power, resisted these changes at every turn. The tension between the monarchy and the barons reached a boiling point, with many of the latter fighting to retain their authority over justice. The barons saw royal interference as an infringement on their privileges, and they were reluctant to relinquish the power they held over their lands and subjects. This resistance led to political conflict, as monarchs struggled to impose their new vision of centralized law. But despite the fierce opposition, the slow march of legal reforms continued. Kings like Henry II of England, for instance, continued to build on the foundations of royal courts and common law, even as they faced pushback from the feudal elite. These monarchs understood that in order to maintain stability and ensure that their rule was not undermined by lawlessness or the arbitrary decisions of individual lords, they had to continue expanding the reach and authority of royal courts. Over time, these reforms would give rise to a system where justice was no longer merely an extension of a ruler's power, but a more structured, rational process, a shift that would not only change how justice was dispensed, but would lay the groundwork for the legal systems that would dominate the modern world. But this transformation didn't come overnight. The emergence of legal reforms was a long and arduous process, and while progress was made, it was often marred by setbacks, resistance, and conflict. As the royal courts took shape and common law began to spread, the new legal practices slowly started to take hold. From the establishment of more sophisticated judicial proceedings to the codification of laws, the idea of a standardized legal system took root. The chaos of medieval justice was beginning to give way to the promise of something more organized, but the struggle for a truly fair system of law was far from over. This evolution would continue to unfold in the coming centuries, but it was already clear that the days of arbitrary, personal justice were numbered. The introduction of jury trials in the medieval period marked a significant turning point in the evolution of law. Before the rise of the jury system, justice was often dispensed by a single powerful figure, usually a lord, king, or religious authority, whose decisions could be influenced by personal biases, political motivations, or even mere whim. But as monarchs sought to centralize power and reform the chaotic, arbitrary legal systems of the past, the jury system emerged as a way to involve a group of people in the decision-making process. What if your life could be decided by a jury of your peers or a group of people you've never met? The jury system, as it was introduced in the medieval period, was a revolutionary concept. It meant that a person's fate was no longer entirely in the hands of a single ruler or judge. Instead, it was shared by a group of peers, often local citizens, who were tasked with determining the truth based on the evidence presented during a trial. The shift from a system where one powerful individual held all the power to one where a collective of individuals made the decision was a momentous change in how justice was dispensed. The process of selecting jurors, however, was far from perfect. In the early days, juries were often chosen from a pool of local inhabitants, typically those who knew the accused or the nature of the crime being tried. This could be both a strength and a weakness. On one hand, the jury was made up of people who had some connection to the community and might understand the context of the case. On the other hand, the jurors' proximity to the individuals involved could lead to bias or favoritism, as personal relationships and local loyalties often played a role in how verdicts were reached. It wasn't uncommon for jurors to make decisions based on their own prejudices or the influence of powerful figures in the community. Still, the idea that a group, rather than a single individual, would have a say in someone's fate was a major step toward a more democratic form of justice. The role of the jury was also critical in how trials were conducted. Unlike earlier trials, which were often held behind closed doors with little transparency, jury trials were more public, allowing the community to witness justice being carried out. This helped ensure that the process was seen as more legitimate, and it also acted as a check on the power of the court. However, the challenges were significant. In many cases, jurors were not trained in legal matters and were often confused by the complexities of the law. Additionally, the jury had to rely on the evidence presented to them, which was often incomplete or manipulated, leaving them to make decisions with limited information. The result was a legal system that was still deeply flawed but beginning to evolve towards something more structured. Despite these challenges, the jury trial had an undeniable impact on the course of justice in the Middle Ages. It marked the beginning of a shift away from rule by autocratic decree and toward a system that sought to involve the community in the pursuit of justice. It laid the foundation for modern-day legal practices, where the right to be judged by a group of one's peers is considered a fundamental aspect of justice. This system, however, was still in its infancy, and as the medieval legal frameworks continued to develop, so too did the methods of punishment. The rise of the jury trial was just one of many changes that would alter the course of medieval justice, and in the next phase of this transformation, the evolution of punishments would begin to take center stage. From the harsh, often violent methods of punishment to the more structured systems that followed, the shift in how people were judged would ultimately lead to the legal systems we know today. Medieval justice was marked by brutal, public punishments that sought not just to punish, but to instill fear in the hearts of the population. The very thought of the methods used to extract confessions and execute the accused can be enough to send a chill down one's spine. In a time when justice was often cruel and arbitrary, the penalty for a crime real or imagined could be as terrifying as the crime itself. Would you risk your life for a mere accusation, or suffer the terrifying consequences? Torture was a common tool in the medieval justice system, used to extract confessions, regardless of whether the accused was guilty or innocent. The most infamous of these devices was the rack, a gruesome contraption designed to stretch the body beyond its limits. The victim would be bound to the rack, and the executioner would turn a wheel, pulling the limbs in opposite directions. The agonizing pain of dislocated joints and stretched muscles could force a confession, though it was often a false one made in desperation to end the suffering. Such methods were not concerned with uncovering truth. They were about breaking the victim mentally and physically. But torture wasn't reserved for only the rack. Another horrific method was the breaking wheel, a device meant to inflict both physical and psychological terror. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, their limbs broken and twisted. Often, they were left to die slowly in front of a crowd, a spectacle designed to show the consequences of defying the law. These public displays of suffering were not only forms of punishment, they were also designed to act as warnings to others. The message was simple: disobey the law, and you too could face unimaginable pain and death. The burning at the stake was another terrifying punishment, often reserved for those accused of heresy or witchcraft. This method of execution was not just about ending a life, it was about sending a message about the eternal punishment waiting for those who dared defy the church or the established order. To be burned alive in front of a crowd was a fate that carried not only physical agony, but also the implication that the soul of the accused was doomed forever, a symbol of ultimate betrayal of both God and man. The spectacle of flames consuming the body was as much about spectacle and fear as it was about justice. Public executions played a crucial role in medieval society. They were not private affairs, they were events for the community, spectacles designed to demonstrate the power of the ruling authorities. The crowds that gathered to watch executions were often as much participants in the punishment as the victims themselves. People came to witness not just the end of a life, but the manifestation of order and power. These events could be deeply unsettling, but they were also a form of entertainment. In a world filled with uncertainty, the grim theatre of public execution offered an uncomfortable but undeniable sense of stability. Yet, while these brutal punishments were intended to enforce the law and create fear, they also had a profound psychological effect on the populace. The constant threat of torture or execution loomed over everyone, creating a society where suspicion and fear ruled. People lived in terror of being accused, knowing that a simple accusation could lead to a gruesome end. The idea that justice could be so easily twisted that a person's fate could be decided by the whim of a powerful lord or a biased jury was a powerful reminder of the vulnerability that came with living under medieval law. These methods of punishment, torture, public executions, and brutal forms of death served as the backbone of medieval justice, reinforcing the idea that the law was a weapon wielded by those in power, not a system meant to protect the innocent. But as history marched on, the evolution of the legal system would bring a shift in how crimes were punished. The system would evolve, moving away from such gruesome spectacles, but the spectre of these dark punishments would continue to haunt the foundations of justice for centuries to come. As medieval justice slowly transformed, it would give way to less gruesome but still harsh methods of punishment. This evolution marked a significant shift in the way societies approached crime and punishment, but it did little to erase the terrifying legacy of the old system. In medieval society, punishment wasn't always about inflicting physical pain. Often, the most effective form of punishment was one that stripped individuals of their dignity, forcing them to confront the scorn and judgment of their entire community. The medieval world knew that the power to humiliate could be as effective as the power to hurt, and public shaming became a tool of justice in a way that shaped the social order. What if your punishment wasn't death, but living with the shame in front of your neighbours? The pillory and stocks were among the most infamous devices used for public humiliation. These wooden contraptions, where an individual would be locked into place, were placed in public spaces, often in the town square or outside the church. The accused would be subjected to the ridicule and jeers of passers-by, forced to endure hours or even days of exposure to the community's scorn. While not physically painful in the way that torture could be, the emotional and psychological toll of such public disgrace was immense. The person trapped in the pillory or stocks was a target for every passerby. Villagers would pelt the guilty party with rotten food, mud, or worse. The person's reputation would be ruined, and they would be forever marked by their shameful display. Public humiliation wasn't reserved only for criminals. Sometimes it was used as a tool of social control, even against those who had committed relatively minor offences. A person who had failed to fulfill a promise, been caught in an affair, or even simply spoken out of turn could find themselves at the mercy of this form of punishment. The act of being displayed in front of the community served to reinforce the social hierarchy, reminding people of their place in the rigid structures of medieval life. The psychological impact of public shaming could be profound. Unlike physical pain, the damage inflicted by humiliation often lasted far beyond the punishment itself. The accused were not only subjected to the disdain of their peers, but were also made to confront their own social alienation. In a world where reputation was everything, a single moment of disgrace could cast a long shadow over a person's life. The stigma could affect their family, their livelihood, and their standing in the community. For many, the lasting damage of public humiliation was worse than the physical pain they might have endured. In a broader sense, the use of public shaming also served to reinforce the power structures of medieval society. The medieval legal system was not just about enforcing laws, it was about maintaining order and control. Public punishment was a way to demonstrate the consequences of defying the social order, making it clear that those who stepped out of line would be held accountable in front of all. It was an emotional deterrent, using the community's collective gaze to enforce conformity. This form of punishment, rooted deeply in shame and social control, was a clear tool of power. It wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers, it was about making an example of them, ensuring that the community knew that stepping outside the prescribed norms would come with public consequences. It was a reminder to everyone that the watchful eyes of society were always present, and transgression would not go unnoticed. As medieval legal practices slowly began to evolve, the concept of fairness started to make its way into how punishments were conceived and carried out. But for many, the emotional scars left by public humiliation would remain a reminder of the deeper ways in which medieval justice sought not just to punish, but to control and shape society's behaviour. The next phase of legal evolution would be marked by a shift toward more rational and systematic approaches, but the echoes of shame would continue to reverberate throughout medieval law. The executioner, a figure cloaked in both power and disdain, held one of the most paradoxical roles in medieval society. Feared by the masses, yet shunned by those who lived around them, executioners were the living embodiment of justice, but their work was often viewed as a necessary evil. What does it take to be the person everyone fears, yet no one wants to speak to? Executioners were tasked with the grim duty of carrying out the most severe punishments: beheading, hanging, burning, and other forms of execution. But their role went far beyond the simple act of ending a life. Executioners were also the ones who carried out torture, often in public, as part of the process of obtaining confessions or punishing transgressions. They played an integral part in the spectacle of medieval justice, where punishments were not only a form of retribution, but also a public display meant to instill fear and maintain order. For these executioners, the act of killing or torturing was part of their job, but it was also an immense psychological burden. While the executioner wielded significant power in the medieval legal system, their power was far from absolute. Executioners were often the lowest of the low in the social hierarchy. They were typically seen as outcasts, hired because of their willingness to carry out such dreaded work. Many towns and villages would have an executioner on retainer, but these individuals rarely lived among the rest of the community. Their families, too, often faced scorn and isolation. Children of executioners were taunted and ostracized, often viewed with the same contempt and fear as their parents. The very nature of the job meant that they were forced to live on the fringes of society. Despite the stigma, the executioner held a certain kind of power. They were feared by those who stood before them, but they also held a unique kind of authority in the medieval world. The executioner's blade could mean freedom from further pain for a condemned soul, or the end of suffering for a victim. In a society where justice was frequently about power and control, the executioner was a figure who held the ultimate authority over life and death. Their hands were the ones that delivered the final sentence, deciding whether a person would live or die. However, the emotional toll of this job was immense. It was not just about carrying out an execution. It was about being the person who inflicted the punishment, whether physical or psychological. For many executioners, the act of killing was not something they did lightly. Some executioners were deeply affected by their work, haunted by the faces of those they had killed. The process of torturing a person to extract a confession could leave emotional scars as well, as it often involved prolonged and agonizing pain. Despite the harshness of their profession, executioners were not always free from guilt or remorse. The executioner's life was one of isolation, but it was also filled with paradox. They were respected for their power to take a life, yet reviled for the very same act. They walked a lonely path, haunted by their role in the medieval justice system, a system that thrived on fear and public spectacle. Even as they played an essential part in the machinery of justice, they were often left without the recognition or companionship that others in society took for granted. This paradox of power and shame is what made the role of the executioner so unique and so unsettling. Though they were crucial to the functioning of medieval justice, they were also marginalized and isolated, their existence a reminder of the dark undercurrents that ran through the justice system. The executioner's role was not just about carrying out orders, it was about living with the stigma of their actions, both within the community and within themselves. From the role of the executioner, we now turn to a broader question. How did the public view these punishments? Were they seen as necessary forms of justice, or were they considered cruel and excessive? The answer was not simple, as medieval society was divided in its perceptions of justice. Some viewed these methods as necessary for maintaining order, while others saw them as barbaric and unjust. This division would play a critical role in shaping how justice evolved in the centuries to come. In medieval times, justice was not a quiet, private affair. It was an event that played out in full view of the public, where punishment was not only about administering retribution to the wrongdoer, but also about sending a message to the entire community. The spectacle of executions and torture, performed in public squares or outside churches, became a regular part of life, a form of entertainment that was as much about control as it was about justice. What if justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers, but about controlling the entire population? The authorities of medieval society understood the power of spectacle. Hangings, burnings, and beheadings were not mere acts of punishment. They were elaborate public displays meant to reinforce social order, maintain power, and serve as a reminder of the consequences of defying the established norms. These events were carefully orchestrated, often attracting large crowds who gathered not only to witness the condemned meet their fate, but to participate in the collective experience of fear, schadenfreude, and social reinforcement. Punishment, in this sense, was an event that involved the entire community, making the act of transgression and its consequences part of the social fabric. Public executions were about more than just satisfying the desire for justice. They were about ensuring that people knew their place in the hierarchical structure of medieval society. The crowd was often made up of peasants, merchants, and townsfolk, and the spectacle was designed to remind them of the power of their rulers. It was an unspoken declaration that those who dared to break the law would be subjected to the same fate, while the rest of society could take comfort in knowing they were protected at least temporarily from such punishment. It served as a terrifying form of social control, ensuring that people conformed to the rules set by the ruling class, and the public nature of the punishment meant that the threat of violence loomed constantly. Beyond its function as a deterrent, these spectacles were also rituals steeped in tradition. The execution itself, whether by hanging or burning at the stake, often had a formalized structure where the condemned might confess their sins, ask for forgiveness, or publicly acknowledge their guilt. This ritualistic aspect added a layer of morality to the punishment, making it seem not only as a legal act but also a moral one. The public nature of the event transformed it into a communal ritual, where the crowd could feel they were participating in the moral order of the universe, in which sinners received their just punishment and the righteous could walk free. The psychological impact of such public events was far-reaching. The crowds that gathered to witness the spectacle were not just passive observers, they were active participants in the maintenance of social order. The mere act of standing in the crowd watching a public execution was, in some ways, a reaffirmation of one's position in society. It was a moment of shared fear and moral righteousness, with the victim serving as a cautionary tale. The emotional effect on the crowd was intense fear, excitement, even a sense of justice being done. These events were traumatic and reinforcing, embedding the idea of punishment and obedience into the collective psyche of the population. In many ways, the public execution was a ritual of power. The authorities knew that a dramatic execution could do more than just punish a criminal. It could shape the behavior of the population, instilling fear and compliance. This was justice as spectacle, a potent reminder that the law and order were maintained through fear and the collective experience of suffering. Justice was not something abstract or hidden. It was visible, visceral, and shared by all. The spectacle was as much about control and power as it was about delivering a verdict. As these public spectacles became more deeply ingrained in medieval life, the idea of punishment began to evolve alongside them. It wasn't long before the legal system itself began to intertwine more closely with the social and political structure of medieval Europe. The forces of power, fear, and obedience shaped not only the way justice was administered, but also how it was perceived by those who lived under its rule. This was just the beginning of a complex web of legal, social, and political dynamics that would define the medieval world for centuries. From the public's perception of justice, we now move to explore how this perception was influenced by the very fabric of medieval society, how law, punishment, and social order were intrinsically tied to the politics of the time. The rise of monarchies and the evolution of legal systems would change the nature of justice, but these foundational spectacles of power would leave their imprint on the ways in which law and order were perceived by the public. Medieval justice, while presented as a means of maintaining order, was often wielded as a tool for consolidating and strengthening political power. For monarchs, lords, and barons, the legal system was not just a way to right wrongs, but a means to enforce loyalty, suppress dissent, and reinforce their control over the kingdom. The concept of justice was, at times, less about fairness and more about maintaining the status quo, using law as a political weapon. Could justice have been nothing more than a game of power for the ruling elite? Rulers understood that the administration of justice was one of their most powerful tools in ensuring control over their subjects. The legal system could be used to reward loyalty and punish disobedience, and it wasn't unusual for a ruler to manipulate the law to achieve political ends. When monarchs wanted to quell a rebellion or weaken a rival, they could use the law to discredit or eliminate those who opposed them. Trials were not always about establishing guilt, they were about sending a message, whether through the public spectacle of an execution or through the confiscation of lands and titles. In this way, justice became an extension of political strategy, with the law serving as a way to maintain power and deter any challenge to the throne. The nobles, too, played their part in this politicized version of justice. Feudal lords, often ruling their domains with absolute power, frequently used their control over the local legal system to settle personal scores, enforce their own political agendas, and reinforce their authority within their territories. Noble families had long-standing rivalries and vendettas, and the legal system offered them a way to resolve conflicts that might otherwise have been settled through open warfare. A well-placed accusation, a well-timed trial, or a strategically executed sentence could destroy a rival's influence, seize their wealth, or strip them of their title. In this way, the justice system was as much about personal ambition as it was about upholding the law. For example, the infamous case of Thomas Becket and King Henry II illustrates the complex intersection of justice, power, and politics. When Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, defied Henry's attempts to exert control over the Church's judicial independence, the monarch sought to use the law and its power to suppress his former ally. Becket's eventual murder in Canterbury Cathedral, although not an execution carried out under the law, was a result of the political tension surrounding their conflicting views on the role of law and justice. Becket's martyrdom would go on to fuel resistance against Henry's use of political power through legal means, showing just how intertwined the two were. Even the legal system itself was subject to political manipulation. As monarchs consolidated more power, the role of the king's courts expanded, and laws were often rewritten or selectively applied to suit the political needs of the day. Kings used justice as a way to undermine noble rivals and to keep control of land, wealth, and military power. The justice system, in many ways, became the crown's primary tool for exercising control over both the land and the people. And yet, for all its manipulation, the political nature of justice was rarely acknowledged outright. Instead, it was cloaked in the veneer of fairness, with the monarchy presenting itself as the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong. However, the political use of justice didn't just end with monarchs and barons. It had profound implications for the common people. A peasant or commoner who found themselves caught in the web of a noble's personal vendetta or a monarch's political ambitions could expect little in the way of impartiality or fairness. The justice system, in these cases, could feel like an insurmountable force, shaped by the interests of the powerful rather than any real sense of right or wrong. From this exploration of how justice was manipulated as a political tool, we now turn to the people who carried out these laws, those who were responsible for implementing the king's or lord's commands on the ground. The enforcers of the law, often working in the shadows, were integral to how justice functioned, and their actions revealed just how deeply the legal system was connected to the power structures of medieval society. In medieval times, the concept of law enforcement was far different from the modern, neutral figures of authority we are familiar with today. Instead of acting as impartial enforcers of justice, medieval lawmen, sheriffs, bailiffs, and constables were often extensions of the political power wielded by lords or kings. Their role in society was fraught with complexities, as they found themselves torn between carrying out the duties of the law and remaining loyal to their superiors, whose whims often shaped the laws they were charged with enforcing. Who enforces the law when the very law you're enforcing is built on power, not fairness? Sheriffs, for example, were the king's representatives in local areas, tasked with maintaining order and ensuring that royal edicts were followed. However, their authority was far from absolute. They were often beholden to the whims of their monarch, but more frequently, they were subordinate to powerful local lords who exerted considerable influence over the day-to-day operations of justice in their regions. A sheriff might be tasked with rounding up criminals or overseeing the enforcement of the king's law, but they were also deeply connected to the local aristocracy, which could mean that their loyalties were often divided. Their role was as much about serving the interests of the elite as it was about ensuring the law was followed. Similarly, bailiffs served as officers of the court and were responsible for executing the orders of the king or lord in matters of law enforcement. They were often tasked with arresting individuals, collecting debts, or ensuring that sentences were carried out. However, like the sheriffs, they were not impartial agents of justice. They were often caught in a moral bind, executing orders that were shaped by political motives rather than fairness. While bailiffs were charged with upholding the law, they were just as likely to enforce the will of the ruling elite, particularly when it came to suppressing rebellion or punishing enemies of the crown. This blurred line between the law and political power put medieval lawmen in a difficult position. They were expected to enforce laws that were not always just or fair, often working to subdue peasants who had been accused of crimes in ways that felt arbitrary and unjust. The law was often a tool of the powerful, and the lawmen who were tasked with carrying it out were caught between loyalty to their superiors and the ethical dilemma of enforcing laws that didn't always serve the people. The dangers faced by medieval lawmen were significant. In a society rife with rebellion, unrest, and political intrigue, law enforcement was often seen as a symbol of oppression. Sheriffs and bailiffs were frequently targets of violence, especially during periods of political unrest. For example, during times of peasant uprisings or during the feudal wars, the lawmen were forced to deal with crowds of angry peasants, many of whom had been pushed to the edge by the harshness of feudal rule. The risk of being killed or ambushed while performing their duties was ever present, adding another layer of complexity to their role. Despite their authority, medieval lawmen had little to no formal training in the modern sense, and they were often chosen based on their connection to the ruling elite rather than their knowledge of legal principles. Their job was dangerous and morally ambiguous, often requiring them to navigate a world where loyalty to the crown or the lord took precedence over any higher sense of justice. From examining the lives of these medieval enforcers of the law, we now turn to a broader discussion about how the legal system itself evolved. While medieval law enforcement was frequently chaotic and politically motivated, the legal system slowly began to formalize over time, with more standardized laws and less arbitrary application. This shift, however, was a gradual process, one that would eventually lead to a system where laws were more rooted in fairness and less in the whims of rulers and their enforcers. The medieval justice system was a patchwork of local customs, feudal traditions, and arbitrary rulings from lords and monarchs. For centuries, laws were applied inconsistently, depending on where you lived, who your ruler was, or which church had jurisdiction over your case. But during the reign of Henry II of England, a significant shift occurred: the emergence of common law. This new system of law sought to standardize legal practices across England, creating a framework that would bring some order to the chaos of medieval justice. Could the chaos of medieval justice have been tamed by something as simple as a set of rules? Henry II was determined to create a system of justice that transcended local customs and the influence of individual lords. He sought to establish a legal system that was consistent, predictable, and applied uniformly across the kingdom. His approach was revolutionary. Instead of relying on arbitrary decisions from local barons or religious authorities, Henry wanted justice to be based on judicial precedent, a system in which past rulings by judges would guide future decisions. This new approach was called common law, and it fundamentally changed the way law was understood and applied. Common law was based on the idea that the law should be consistent, not left to the whims of the ruling class. It introduced the concept of legal precedent, meaning that decisions made in past cases would set a standard for how future cases should be judged. If a case had been decided in a certain way previously, that ruling would influence the decisions of future judges handling similar cases. This shift towards precedent was essential in moving away from the chaotic and sometimes contradictory rulings of medieval justice. Judges played a pivotal role in this new system. Rather than simply enforcing the decrees of local lords or monarchs, they became interpreters of the law. They would travel the country, hearing cases in the king's name, and their decisions would gradually form a body of legal rulings that could be referred to in future cases. Over time, these judges helped establish a more unified legal system, one that operated on established principles rather than personal favor or regional customs. Common law also had a significant impact on the role of the jury. The idea of juries, which had already begun to take root, was further strengthened under the common law system. Juries were not just a means of determining guilt or innocence, they became an integral part of ensuring fairness in the legal process. Juries, in theory, helped to balance the power of judges and the ruling elite, providing a means by which the people could have a say in legal matters. The rise of common law represented a critical moment in the history of justice. It was a move away from the arbitrary rule of individual rulers and the chaotic justice of the medieval world toward a more organized, predictable system of law. The common law system introduced the idea of fairness, consistency, and legal precedent, marking the beginning of a more structured approach to justice that would lay the foundation for modern legal systems. This transition to common law didn't just affect how cases were decided, it had profound implications for the punishments and trials that would follow. As the law became more formalized, some of the brutal methods of medieval justice, such as torture and public executions, began to be challenged and replaced with less severe forms of punishment. This marks a turning point in the evolution of medieval justice, setting the stage for a more rational and humane system of law enforcement. The brutal punishments of the medieval justice system, including public executions, torture, and mutilations, were hallmarks of a society that viewed justice as a means of instilling fear and asserting control. Yet, over time, these cruel practices began to fall out of favor. As legal reforms took root and ideas of fairness and human rights began to spread, a new approach to justice emerged, one that sought to move away from terror and towards rationality and reform. What sparked the movement to finally end the terrifying cruelty of medieval punishment? The decline of torturous punishments was closely linked to the shifting political landscape and the influence of Enlightenment ideas. The 17th and 18th centuries marked a period of profound social and intellectual transformation across Europe. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham began to challenge the prevailing attitudes toward punishment, advocating for more humane treatment of criminals. Beccaria's groundbreaking work, On Crimes and Punishments, times 1764, argued that punishment should be rational and proportional to the crime, and that torture was not only cruel but ineffective in obtaining truth. His ideas promoted a shift toward more measured, less brutal methods of justice, emphasizing the rehabilitation of offenders rather than their degradation. At the same time, the growing role of royal courts in centralizing power also contributed to the decline of medieval torture. Monarchs increasingly sought to assert their authority by standardizing laws across their realms, which made the use of arbitrary, brutal punishments less feasible. As kings and queens sought to project a more controlled and orderly image of their rule, they began to distance themselves from the chaos of feudal justice, including the excessive cruelty of public executions and torture. Royal courts increasingly adopted practices based on fairness and the rule of law, moving away from the brutal methods that had once been commonplace in local courts and lord-controlled justice systems. The shift was also driven by societal attitudes. As literacy rates increased and the ideas of the Enlightenment spread, the public began to view torture and cruel punishments as barbaric remnants of a less civilized age. The public spectacle of executions, once seen as entertainment and a necessary tool for social control, began to be viewed with increasing discomfort. The idea that justice should be about retribution and deterrence, rather than fear and spectacle, began to gain ground. These changing attitudes were not confined to intellectual circles. They resonated with the broader population, particularly as growing cities and towns began to demand a legal system that could deliver fairness, consistency, and proportionality. Key reformers played crucial roles in pushing these changes. John Howard, an English prison reformer, advocated for better conditions for prisoners and the abolition of certain cruel practices, such as the use of chains and manacles. William Blackstone, a renowned legal scholar, also contributed to the reform movement by emphasizing the importance of a justice system based on reason rather than revenge. These voices helped to shift the focus of legal systems from punishment to justice, from terror to fairness. While the shift away from torture and barbaric punishments didn't happen overnight, these movements marked a turning point in how justice was viewed. Torture, once seen as a necessary evil to extract confessions or punish wrongdoers, was gradually replaced by less physically brutal methods like imprisonment and fines. Public executions, once a public spectacle, began to be seen as a cruel and unnecessary form of punishment. The evolution of legal practices thus began to align more with the principles of fairness and proportionality, leading to a criminal justice system that was more humane and structured. This period of reform was just the beginning of a transformation in how justice was administered, but it had a profound impact on the everyday lives of common people. As we look deeper into the changes in legal practices, we'll see how these reforms affected the experiences of those subjected to medieval justice, and how the law increasingly became a force for stability and fairness, albeit still with flaws and challenges to overcome. The medieval justice system, with its brutality, complexity, and inherent contradictions, may seem like a distant relic of a less enlightened age. Yet, its influence endures in the very fabric of our modern legal systems. As the centuries passed, many aspects of medieval law, despite the reforms and shifts toward fairness, became foundational to the justice systems we take for granted today. What if the justice system we take for granted today was shaped by the darkest corners of medieval history? The concept of courts as the central authority in administering justice can trace its roots directly to the medieval period. While monarchs and lords had their own courts in earlier times, it was during the reign of Henry II that royal courts began to take shape, becoming more formalized institutions that would, over time, to evolve into the modern judicial system. The medieval court system, with judges and legal representatives, set the stage for how we organize trials today. The common law system, which began to take hold under Henry II, laid the groundwork for the precedent-based legal systems that are central to many modern legal traditions, particularly in common law countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. The idea that past rulings could guide current decisions became an essential part of legal reasoning, transforming justice from a series of arbitrary decisions into a more predictable system. Perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of medieval justice is the jury system. The practice of having a group of citizens decide the fate of the accused, a concept introduced during medieval times, has become a cornerstone of legal systems in many Western nations. Though it evolved considerably over the centuries, the fundamental idea that a group of ordinary people should have a role in determining guilt or innocence has its origins in medieval trials. This shift away from singular rulings by lords or monarchs to collective decision-making helped to democratize justice and ensure that it was not solely the privilege of the powerful. Despite the significant reforms, some medieval practices continue to echo in today's justice systems. While torture as a method of obtaining confessions has long been abolished, modern legal systems still grapple with the legacy of these brutal methods in terms of coercion and fairness in criminal investigations. In many ways, the debate surrounding the ethics of interrogation, the treatment of prisoners, and the balance between security and civil liberties are modern echoes of the medieval concerns about justice, punishment, and power. The medieval justice system's brutality also remains part of the historical narrative, influencing public perceptions of punishment and law enforcement. From public executions to the harsh methods of torture, these ancient practices continue to fuel our fascination with the darker aspects of justice. The spectacle of medieval punishment, both horrific and dramatic, has become an enduring part of our collective imagination. It feeds into modern depictions of the past, whether through films, books, or documentaries, where the cruelty of medieval justice is often juxtaposed with the more rational and measured systems of law that emerged later. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the medieval justice system is its complexity, the way that law and power were intricately tied together. Today, while the systems may be more structured and refined, the tensions between law and power, the quest for fairness, and the desire to control and punish continue to shape our legal landscape. The medieval period reminds us that the development of justice has always been a messy, difficult process, and while we've come a long way from the torturous methods of the past, the shadows of medieval justice still linger in modern law. This reflection on the medieval justice system sets the stage for the next chapter, where we will explore the final legacy of medieval law and how the ongoing evolution of legal systems continues to be influenced by the complexities and contradictions of the past. The history of justice is never linear. It is a continual dialogue between past and present, with each era shaping the next. Medieval trials were often a far cry from the fair and transparent legal proceedings we expect today. Some of the most infamous cases in history weren't just about establishing guilt or innocence. They were about political agendas, hidden motivations, and the manipulation of the law to maintain control. These trials, clouded in secrecy and controversy, are still talked about today, not just for the lives they affected, but for the mysterious forces that shaped their outcomes. What if the most famous trials in history weren't just about justice, but about erasing the truth? One of the most notorious trials in medieval history was that of Joan of Arc. In 1431, the French peasant girl who had led armies against the English was tried for heresy and witchcraft. What seemed like a straightforward trial quickly revealed itself to be anything but. Joan's conviction was heavily influenced by political motives. She was viewed not as a religious figure, but as a powerful symbol of resistance to the English occupation of France. The trial was a politically charged spectacle, orchestrated by her enemies to discredit her and diminish the legitimacy of her cause. Joan was interrogated harshly, often under duress, and her confessions were extracted through intimidation, not truth. What was most chilling was that, despite the clear manipulation of her trial, Joan's fate was sealed. She was burned at the stake. Her trial, more than just a legal proceeding, was a calculated attempt to erase the threat she posed to the political order. Another infamous case was the witch trials that plagued medieval Europe. These trials were not about seeking truth, they were about fear and control. In regions like Germany, France, and England, thousands of people, primarily women, were accused of witchcraft, often with no solid evidence to back the charges. The trials were marked by hysteria, with confessions extracted through torture and fear, where the line between truth and fiction was blurred. The Malleus Maleficarum, a treatise published in 1487, served as a handbook for persecuting witches and endorsed methods that allowed for little to no defense. What made these trials so terrifying wasn't just the grotesque punishments, often burning or hanging, but the fact that the accused had little hope of justice. Political and religious leaders used these trials to maintain power, exploiting the fear of witchcraft to unite people under a common cause, even if it meant sentencing innocents to horrific deaths. The trial of the Templars, which took place in 1307, is another case shrouded in mystery. The Knights Templar, a powerful and wealthy order of knights, were arrested by King Philip IV of France under charges of heresy and blasphemy. But the trial was more than a legal matter. It was a way for Philip to seize the Templars' vast wealth and undermine a potential threat to his authority. The Templars were tortured into confessing false charges, including accusations of secret rituals and heretical practices. The trial was less about the Templars' guilt and more about Philip's desire to rid himself of a rival faction. In the end, many of the accused Templars were burned at the stake, their wealth absorbed by the crown, and their reputation tarnished forever, despite the lack of credible evidence against them. These trials, like many others in medieval history, weren't simply about the pursuit of justice. They were about power, control, and the preservation of political or religious interests. The public, often left in the dark about the true motivations behind these proceedings, became spectators in a drama driven by hidden agendas and manipulated truths. The secrecy surrounding these trials added an element of mystique, as people were left to wonder about the actual motives behind them. Were the accused really guilty, or were they merely pawns in a larger game? The unsettling nature of these trials highlights the deep flaws of the medieval justice system, one where law and politics were intricately entwined, and the truth often took a backseat to those in power. As we look back on these notorious cases, we see that medieval trials weren't just about finding the guilty. They were a tool for erasing the inconvenient truth and shaping history according to the desires of the ruling elite. After delving into these infamous trials and their often hidden motivations, we now transition to a more hopeful chapter in the evolution of medieval justice, the rise of more organized and transparent legal procedures. As the medieval world began to shift toward a more formalized legal system, trials would become less about political manipulation and more about the pursuit of truth and fairness, albeit with its own set of challenges. The medieval witch hunts represent one of the darkest and most tragic chapters in the history of justice. What began as isolated accusations of sorcery and heresy quickly escalated into widespread mass hysteria, leading to the torture and execution of thousands of people, mostly women. These hunts were fueled not by evidence or reason, but by superstition, fear, and political agendas. What if the law was used to eliminate your neighbor simply because they were different or accused of witchcraft? During the medieval period, the belief in witches was widespread. People believed that some individuals had the power to make pacts with the devil, causing harm to others through magic. These accusations were not just about spiritual or religious concerns, they were deeply entwined with societal fears, gender dynamics, and even political strategy. Witchcraft was often associated with rebellion or subversion. In times of social unrest, it was easy for the ruling class to target certain individuals, especially women, the elderly, and those who stood out as scapegoats for larger problems like crop failure, disease, or political instability. Accusations of witchcraft became a way to suppress potential threats and maintain control over the populace. The idea of witches was also gendered. Women, particularly those who lived alone, were vulnerable to being accused of witchcraft. In a society that placed great value on women's roles as mothers and wives, any woman who did not conform to social norms, whether through her behavior, her independence, or her non-conformity, could be seen as a threat. The majority of those accused and executed as witches were women, and their status in society as the weaker sex made them easy targets for accusations based on nothing more than rumors or personal grudges. Religious fears also played a significant role. The church was a powerful force in medieval society, and the growing power of religious institutions in the 15th and 16th centuries led to more aggressive witch hunts. The Catholic Church, seeing heresy as a major threat, often conflated witchcraft with acts of defiance against God. The Malleus Maleficarum, a treatise written in 1487, provided detailed instructions for identifying, accusing, and prosecuting witches, and its influence sparked the fear-driven witch hunts that followed. Witchcraft, in the eyes of the Church, wasn't just about magic, it was about disobedience to the Church's authority, and anyone suspected of this could be condemned as a heretic. The consequences of these accusations were horrific. Once someone was accused of witchcraft, their fate was almost sealed. Torture was often used to extract confessions, with methods like the rack, waterboarding, or sleep deprivation being employed to force a confession of guilt. These confessions, made under extreme duress, were frequently false, but were nonetheless used as evidence in court. In many cases, trials were held with little to no regard for the evidence, and the accused were sentenced to death, often by burning at the stake or hanging. The public nature of these executions was meant to serve as a grim warning to anyone who might dare to challenge the established order. The witch hunts were not just a religious issue but a social one. they represented the intersection of fear, power, and superstition. The ruling classes, through the manipulation of fear and religious fervor, used witch hunts to solidify their control and eliminate perceived threats. For those accused, the judicial system, if it could be called that, was a system of punishment based on fear, not justice. These hunts, carried out in the name of justice, were anything but just. Innocent people, often with no more than the misfortune of being different, were condemned to gruesome deaths. The tragic consequences of the witch hunts challenge our modern understanding of justice. The law, which is supposed to serve as a tool for fairness and protection, was perverted by superstition and fear, leading to the brutal persecution of innocent people. These events were not about truth, but about eliminating those who were feared or misunderstood. Having explored the dark side of medieval justice through the lens of the witch hunts, we now turn to how this fear and superstition influenced the broader system of justice. How did these events shape the everyday lives of common people who lived in constant fear of being accused, and how did this system evolve into something more rational over time? The witch hunts, while rooted in superstition, were part of a broader pattern that shaped how justice was applied in medieval society, and their legacy would reverberate through the centuries. The Inquisition is one of the most notorious chapters in the history of medieval justice. It represents a time when the law and religion were not separate, but intricately intertwined, with the Church wielding its vast power to not only dictate spiritual beliefs, but also enforce those beliefs through legal means. The Inquisition was designed to root out heresy, any belief or practice that deviated from the teachings of the Church, and to purify society by eliminating perceived threats to the orthodoxy. Could a single belief have condemned you to a life of suffering or death? For many during the medieval period, the answer was tragically yes. The Catholic Church, which held immense influence in Europe, was determined to maintain religious conformity across its realms. When heresy emerged, it was not merely a theological disagreement, it was seen as a challenge to the very foundation of the social order. The Inquisition, established in the 12th century, and most infamous in its form as the Spanish Inquisition of the late 15th century, was the Church's primary tool for identifying and punishing heretics. Trials of those accused of heresy were often harsh, and the accused were subjected to interrogation and torture in order to extract confessions of guilt. The methods used by inquisitors were both brutal and terrifying. Torture was frequently employed to force confessions from the accused, often under the pretense that the act of confession would lead to salvation. The infamous rack, where the body was stretched to excruciating lengths, and waterboarding, where the accused was forced to swallow water until they nearly suffocated, were among the cruel techniques used to break the spirit and extract a confession. The wheel, thumbscrews, and other devices of physical torment were common, designed not just to punish, but to inflict suffering in hopes of breaking the will of the accused. For those who confessed, the punishment was often death, typically by burning at the stake, and for those who denied the charges, the punishment could be even more horrific, as they were forced to endure further torture to prove their guilt. Many innocent people confessed to crimes they never committed, simply to end the agony, knowing that a forced confession, however false, was often the only way to escape the terror of torture. For others, death was the only escape, as they faced the choice between torture or burning alive in front of a public crowd. The Inquisition was not just about punishing those accused of heresy, it was also a deeply political tool, used by the Church and secular rulers alike to control the population. Fear of being accused of heresy created an atmosphere of terror, where ordinary people were coerced into denouncing their neighbours, leading to a climate of distrust and suspicion. The inquisitors often exploited these dynamics, using fear to strengthen their power over communities. Even those who were not personally accused were affected by the looming threat of the Inquisition, which sought not just to punish, but to instill conformity across entire populations. As terrible as the methods were, the Inquisition was also a reflection of the era's belief in the absolute authority of the Church and the intertwining of religious and legal power. It wasn't just a matter of religious belief, any challenge to the authority of the Church was seen as a threat to the social order itself. The brutality of the Inquisition highlights the extent to which justice in the medieval period was shaped by the Church's control over both spiritual and secular matters. The legacy of the Inquisition still lingers in our understanding of justice today. It serves as a chilling example of how the law, when combined with religious zeal, can become an instrument of oppression. In an era when belief and justice were indistinguishable, the Inquisition stands as a dark reminder of the dangers of religious intolerance and the abuse of legal power in the name of faith. This grim exploration of the Inquisition sets the stage for understanding how superstition, fear, and religious authority shaped medieval justice. Over time, these influences gave way to a more secular and institutional approach to law, but the legacy of religious tribunals and the moral and ethical dilemmas they posed would continue to shape the evolution of justice systems in the centuries that followed. Medieval law was built on a foundation that viewed men and women as fundamentally unequal, not only in social life but under the eyes of the courts themselves. A woman's identity was often defined by the men around her, first her father, then her husband, and finally her sons, if she lived long enough to outlast the others. Her rights, her property, even her voice in the courtroom were restricted by laws that had been shaped over centuries. What if the very laws of justice were stacked against you simply because of your gender? Under medieval law, women were frequently treated as property, which meant they had limited legal standing. Their testimony was often considered less credible than that of a man, and in some courts, it could even be dismissed outright unless supported by male witnesses. This imbalance influenced everything from accusations of adultery to disputes over land. A woman accused of adultery, for instance, faced severe repercussions. While a man's indiscretions might be quietly forgiven or overlooked, a woman's supposed sin was treated as a stain on the honor of her husband or family, a crime not just against morality, but against the social order. Punishments ranged from public humiliation to harsh physical penalties, reflecting the belief that a woman's behavior carried far greater consequences for society. Inheritance laws were similarly skewed. Sons were almost always the preferred heirs, even when a daughter might be more capable or the natural choice. In many regions, women could not inherit land at all unless no male relatives remained. This meant that widows often found themselves at the mercy of male guardians or new landlords who had no obligation to protect their interests. Even wealthy noble women, despite their status, faced restrictions that limited their autonomy. Their marriages were often arranged to create alliances, and their property transferred to their husbands the moment vows were spoken. The legal double standard extended into criminal justice. Women who violated societal expectations by acting independently, speaking too boldly, or simply existing outside the roles assigned to them could face disproportionately harsh penalties. A man who became drunk and disorderly might be fined. A woman who behaved similarly could be branded immoral or disruptive. Crimes like infanticide or poisoning, stereotypically associated with women in medieval imagination, were met with particular brutality. These charges often required little evidence. Suspicion alone could cast a woman into the depths of a legal system already inclined to see her as guilty. Even in lesser disputes, women found themselves disadvantaged. If a woman was injured or wronged, compensation for her harm was often paid to her husband or father, not to her. Her suffering was treated as a financial inconvenience to the man who owned her, rather than a violation of her personhood. In this way, justice failed to see her as an individual altogether. For many women, simply navigating daily life meant walking a narrow line between obedience and survival. Their gender made them vulnerable not only to social judgment, but to legal punishment. In a world defined by patriarchal power, the law functioned as yet another force shaping what women could or could not be. These gendered biases had long-reaching consequences. They laid the groundwork for later persecution, including the wave of witchcraft accusations that would engulf Europe, where women who stepped outside accepted roles became easy targets. From understanding the inequities women faced in the courtroom, we now move into the darker territory of how these same prejudices fueled the hunts that turned suspicion into deadly persecution. Throughout the medieval period, women found themselves at the center of accusations that were shaped less by evidence and more by deeply entrenched beliefs about gender. In a world governed by fear, superstition, and patriarchal authority, women were seen as uniquely susceptible to temptation and spiritual corruption. These assumptions laid the foundation for accusations of witchcraft that would come to define some of the era's most haunting legal proceedings. What was it about women that made them targets for the most brutal accusations and punishments? The answer lies in the way society viewed female independence as a threat to both social order and religious authority. Women who lived outside accepted roles, Widows, healers, midwives, or those who simply kept to themselves were often the first to be accused. Their knowledge of herbs or healing practices, once valued by their communities, could quickly be recast as evidence of sorcery when fear took hold. In times of famine, plague, or political unrest, people searched for someone to blame, and women made convenient scapegoats. The legal framework allowed suspicion alone to ignite a trial, and once accusations began, they rarely stopped. A neighbor's whisper, a family dispute, or a misinterpreted illness could end in devastating consequences. The church and state both played powerful roles in reinforcing these accusations. Religious authorities believed that women, portrayed as morally weaker, were more easily swayed by demonic forces. This belief shaped not only sermons but legal decisions. Courts operating under canon law viewed women's supposed frailty as justification for harsh interrogation, often involving torture. Secular courts followed suit, using confessions extracted under extreme duress as proof of guilt. The moment a woman was accused, the system began working against her, trapping her within a cycle of suspicion where no defense was strong enough to counter deeply rooted fears. These trials revealed how gendered stereotypes shaped the fate of the accused. Women were often portrayed as emotionally unstable or intellectually weak, traits that reinforced the idea that they were more likely to fall under dark influences. Their ordinary actions, an argument with a neighbor, a midwife's failed delivery, a widow's independence, could be transformed into damning evidence. In many regions, the overwhelming majority of those executed for witchcraft were female. The trials became less about uncovering wrongdoing and more about policing behavior, punishing women who stepped outside narrow expectations, and maintaining a patriarchal order through fear and public spectacle. These tragedies left deep marks on medieval communities, shaping how people understood justice, morality, and danger. Families learned that even the smallest misunderstanding could spiral into catastrophe, especially for women whose lives were constantly under scrutiny. Fear became a quiet companion in daily life, reminding everyone that accusation alone could destroy everything. The persecution of women during the witch hunts exposes how law, religion, and gender together created a perfect storm of oppression. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that justice was never neutral. From these grim stories, we now turn to the broader ways gender shaped medieval society itself today. Medieval society was built upon a strict hierarchy that placed men firmly at the top, shaping every facet of life, from family structure to political authority, and the justice system reflected these values with absolute clarity. Laws were not merely tools for maintaining order, they were powerful instruments that helped define and enforce gender roles. In a world where power flowed almost exclusively through male hands, women found themselves confined to roles that offered little autonomy or legal recognition. What if the law itself was designed to keep women under the control of men? From the earliest stages of life, gender dictated expectation. A boy was groomed for leadership, inheritance, and authority, while a girl was guided toward obedience, marriage, and service. These roles were not simply encouraged, they were mandated through the legal codes that governed medieval life. Marriage, for instance, was not only a personal union, but a legal contract that transferred a woman's rights and property to her husband. Once wed, a woman lost most independent legal standing. In the courts, her voice was often considered secondary to that of her husband, who acted as her legal representative. Even her physical safety was interpreted within the framework of male guardianship. If wronged, compensation was frequently paid to the man who owned her, rather than to the woman herself. Inheritance laws reflected the same hierarchy. Sons were the primary heirs, and daughters were often excluded unless no male heir existed. Even then, women's claims were vulnerable to challenge, and marriages were arranged to ensure that any property they did inherit would eventually pass into male hands. These laws weren't arbitrary, they were intentional mechanisms designed to keep land, wealth, and power consolidated among men. The justice system reinforced this distribution, ensuring that women's economic and social dependence remained firmly intact. The legal system also shaped gender roles by punishing women who violated expectations. Women who spoke too boldly, acted independently, or resisted marriage could be labeled disobedient or morally corrupt, facing harsh social and sometimes legal consequences. Meanwhile, men who wielded authority with aggression or control were often celebrated for demonstrating strength. This imbalance made it dangerous for women to step outside prescribed roles, as their actions were more easily interpreted as threats to both family honor and social stability. The courts upheld these interpretations, frequently siding with male authority figures and reinforcing patriarchal norms. Yet, toward the end of the medieval period, subtle shifts began to emerge. The rise of urban centers, changing economic structures, and the gradual development of more formalized legal systems created small cracks in the rigid gender hierarchy. Some women began to play larger roles in business and trade, especially widows who inherited their husbands' enterprises. Courts in certain regions started to recognize limited rights for women in matters of property or contracts, particularly as literacy spread and legal documentation became more common. These changes were modest, but they hinted at a slow transformation, one where the ironclad gender roles enforced by medieval justice were beginning to loosen. Still, the overarching legacy of medieval justice is one of entrenched inequality. The law, shaped by patriarchal values, ensured that gender roles remained deeply rooted and difficult to challenge. Understanding these structures reminds us of how profoundly legal systems can shape society and how difficult it can be to dismantle them once they take hold. With this examination of gender justice, we move toward the final phase of medieval legal evolution, where shifting social structures and new ideas begin to erode these old systems, setting the stage for the modern concepts of justice that would follow. The final centuries of the medieval period marked the slow fading of a justice system, shaped by feudal power, one built on personal authority, local customs, and often brutal enforcement. As Europe began to shift toward a new era, the foundations that had upheld feudal justice for centuries started to crumble. The lords who once ruled their lands with near absolute authority saw their influence wane, replaced by rising monarchs and the emergence of centralized governments. Could the brutal medieval justice system have been swept away by something as simple as centralization and reason? In many ways, yes, though the process was long, uneven, and driven by forces far greater than any single ruler. One of the most significant changes came with the rise of nation-states. As monarchs consolidated territory and power, the old patchwork of feudal fiefdoms began to give way to larger, more unified political entities. With this shift came the need for standardized laws that applied across the realm, rather than the inconsistent and often arbitrary customs that varied from village to village. Kings and queens recognized that to govern effectively, they needed legal systems that reflected their authority, not the whims of local lords. Royal courts expanded, written laws became more common, and the foundations of feudal justice began to erode. The growth of cities played an equally important role. As Europe's population recovered from famine and plague, towns and cities flourished. Urban life required clearer rules, more predictable systems of justice, and officials who were accountable to something beyond local tradition. Merchants, craftsmen, and guilds all needed consistent laws to regulate trade, contracts, and disputes. The old feudal model, built on loyalty and land, no longer fit the needs of increasingly complex, interconnected communities. City charters and urban courts became early examples of centralized law in action, offering an alternative to the often violent and unpredictable justice of the countryside. Meanwhile, the intellectual shift brought on by the Enlightenment began to challenge long-standing assumptions about power, punishment, and the role of the state. Thinkers such as Montesquieu, Locke, and Beccaria questioned the legitimacy of cruel punishments and arbitrary trials. They argued that laws should be rational, grounded in universal principles, and applied equally to all people. These ideas undermined the foundations of feudal justice and inspired reforms that prioritized fairness over fear and reason over brutality. Slowly, the belief that justice should serve the common good, not the personal interests of the powerful, began to take hold. As monarchies strengthened and legal systems grew more centralized, the authority of local lords faded into memory. No longer could a baron preside over midnight trials, torture confessions from the accused, or mete out punishments based solely on personal desire. Courts became more structured, judges more qualified, and written laws more widely distributed. What emerged was not yet the modern legal system we know today, but it was a clear step away from the chaos and cruelty that had characterized the medieval world. The end of feudal justice marks a turning point, a moment when Europe began to move away from fragmented, personalized authority and towards systems that sought consistency, fairness, and order. But legal evolution did not stop there. From this shift in political power, a new wave of intellectual and philosophical change would rise, challenging not only how justice was administered, but the very nature of human rights and the principles that underpin modern law. The twilight of the medieval world brought with it a new force ideas. Long before laws changed on paper, they began to shift in the minds of philosophers, scholars, and reformers who dared to question centuries of entrenched brutality. For the first time, people began to argue that justice should serve humanity rather than fear, that the law should be grounded in fairness rather than pain. What if the end of medieval cruelty was sparked by the power of reason and a few brave voices? The rise of Enlightenment, thought in the 17th and 18th centuries, marked a profound transformation in how society understood justice. Thinkers like Cesare, Beccaria, Montesquieu, and John Locke challenged the belief that torture was a necessary tool for extracting truth or maintaining order. Beccaria's Times on Crimes and Punishments, Times became a revolutionary text, arguing that torture was not only barbaric but ineffective. His ideas spread quickly across Europe, offering a new vision of justice, one that prioritized rationality over cruelty, proportionality over spectacle, and rehabilitation over terror. Montesquieu, whose writings shaped modern political systems, insisted that laws must be clear, predictable, and rooted in the separation of powers. His influence helped dismantle the arbitrary rule that had defined medieval courts, replacing it with frameworks that insisted on accountability and restraint. Locke emphasized natural rights, the idea that every person possesses inherent dignity and freedoms that no ruler or law could rightfully violate. These concepts laid the intellectual groundwork for modern human rights and forever altered how societies viewed punishment. This philosophical shift reached legal institutions as monarchs and governments began adopting reforms. Torture, once sanctioned as a legitimate tool of interrogation, was slowly outlawed across Europe. Public executions, once attended by cheering crowds, began to be viewed with unease and eventually disappeared from most legal systems. Trials grew more structured and transparent, with trial by jury becoming increasingly common. No longer was guilt determined by ordeal or confession, extracted under agony. Instead, evidence, testimony, and reason guided the process. The development of legal codes further solidified this transformation. Countries began to write down their laws, creating systems that could be studied, understood, and crucially applied consistently. The Napoleonic Code, for example, became one of the most influential legal documents in modern history, offering clear rules that replaced centuries of unclear customs. Even in England, where common law continued to evolve through precedent, legal reforms emphasized fairness and the rights of the accused, including the right to defense and the presumption of innocence. Activists and reformers played a critical role as well. Figures like John Howard, who exposed the horrific conditions within prisons, pushed for improvements that treated inmates as human beings rather than living remnants of crime. Their efforts signaled a broader societal turn toward compassion and responsibility, transforming punishment from a display of dominance into a system of justice aimed at moral and civil progress. By the 18th century, the world had begun to accept a radical notion: justice should protect, not terrify. Fairness, rights, and due process were no longer abstract ideals. They became guiding principles for courts and lawmakers. Medieval cruelty, once so deeply ingrained in the legal system, gradually lost its footing as reason illuminated the path toward a more humane future. From this intellectual and philosophical awakening, legal reforms moved beyond theory and into the daily lives of ordinary people. Next, we explore how this transformation gave rise to the modern justice systems we recognize today, reshaping the world far beyond medieval imagination. The echoes of medieval justice still linger in the modern world, woven quietly into the systems we often assume were born from pure reason and enlightened thought. The transformation from ordeal and torture to courts and constitutions did not erase the past it built upon it. Many of the principles we now view as essential to fairness have roots in the very era defined by brutality and fear. What if the justice system we take for granted today was born from the darkest corners of medieval history? One of the most enduring legacies is the trial by jury. Though primitive in its earliest form, the medieval idea that ordinary people should play a role in deciding guilt or innocence evolved into a cornerstone of modern justice. Today's juries, selected to ensure impartiality and fairness, reflect the long journey from medieval panels of familiar neighbours, who often carried biases of their own, to bodies meant to protect the accused from unchecked authority. The very concept of being judged not by a ruler but by one's peers is a powerful inheritance from an age that otherwise struggled with fairness. The influence of legal precedent is another lasting gift from the medieval period. As common law developed in England, judges began relying on previous rulings to guide new ones, laying the groundwork for systems that value consistency and predictability. Modern courts around the world still rely heavily on this principle. It ensures that justice is not reinvented with each case, but anchored in accumulated wisdom. What began as an attempt to bring order to a fragmented world became one of the most stabilizing forces in modern legal thought. Even the notion of individual rights, though shaped more clearly by later Enlightenment ideals, can trace early threads back to medieval reforms. Documents like the Magna Carta, born from conflict between King John and his barons, introduced the groundbreaking idea that even rulers were subject to the law. Though far from a universal human rights declaration, it planted the seed that authority should have limits. Over time, this seed grew into the belief that all people, regardless of status, deserve protection under the law. Yet medieval justice leaves behind darker legacies as well. The remnants of public shaming survive in the court of public opinion. The impulse to punish swiftly and visibly, once displayed in town squares, now plays out on digital platforms. And the tension between power and justice, so central to the medieval system, still shapes debates about authority, fairness, and who the law truly serves. Our fascination with medieval justice endures because it reflects something deeply human: the struggle to define right and wrong, to balance power with fairness, and to create systems that protect rather than harm. The medieval world reveals how justice can be used to elevate or to oppress, to illuminate truth or to conceal it. Understanding that history allows us to see our modern systems more clearly, recognizing that their strengths were hard-won and their weaknesses still evolving. As this chapter closes, we turn toward a broader reflection on the timeless human desire for justice, how our pursuit of fairness continues to shift with each generation, always shaped by what came before. The Renaissance swept across Europe like a long-awaited breath of clarity after centuries of darkness. It was a revival of art, science, and philosophy, but it was also the beginning of a profound transformation in how people understood justice, power, and the rights of the individual. As scholars rediscovered the writings of ancient Greece and Rome, new questions began to echo through universities, courts, and royal halls. Could the rebirth of ancient ideas have sparked the end of medieval brutality and the birth of modern justice? During this period, thinkers turned away from the rigid, fear-driven structures of medieval law and toward the rational principles of classical antiquity. Ancient philosophers had long argued that law should serve not the whims of rulers, but the needs of society. Their ideas, newly rediscovered, challenged the long-accepted belief that kings and lords were the ultimate arbiters of justice. If law was meant to reflect order, reason, and the natural rights of human beings, then the brutality of medieval punishment, torture, public executions, trials by ordeal began to appear not just cruel, but irrational. Figures like Hugo Grotius, often called the father of international law, emerged from this growing intellectual movement. Grotius argued that laws should be grounded in universal principles that applied to everyone, regardless of their status. In his view, justice was not a tool for controlling subjects, but a system rooted in natural rights that no ruler could rightfully violate. His ideas laid the first stones on the path away from divine right absolutism and toward a world where justice had to be justified, not simply declared. A century later, William Blackstone helped further transform legal thought. His Times, Commentaries on the Laws of England, Times organized and explained English common law in a way that ordinary people, not just scholars, could understand. Blackstone didn't simply restate the law, he humanized it. He emphasized the importance of personal liberties, fair trials, and the presumption of innocence. In doing so, he offered a blueprint for a legal system built not on intimidation but on reason. His work would influence generations of lawmakers, shaping the legal traditions of Britain, America, and many other nations. This shift in thinking was reinforced by the Renaissance emphasis on the worth of the individual. Art and literature began celebrating human potential rather than divine punishment. Philosophers explored the nature of free will, responsibility, and moral agency. As these ideas spread, the justice system slowly began to change with them. The unquestioned authority of monarchs weakened, replaced by the idea that rulers themselves were bound by laws. Written legal codes expanded, courts became more structured and less reliant on superstition. Trials shifted toward evidence and deliberation, rather than fear and ritual. None of these changes happened overnight. The Renaissance did not instantly erase medieval brutality, but it planted seeds ideas powerful enough to outlast kings, outgrow empires, and reshape entire nations. It marked the beginning of a world where justice was something to build, refine, and protect, not merely endure. With this rebirth of legal thought came the next great transformation, the rise of judicial systems that valued fairness, rationality, and individual rights. From here, we move into the age when justice began to resemble the systems we recognize today, structured, principled, and shaped by centuries of evolving human understanding. The Enlightenment ignited a profound transformation in the way society understood justice. No longer were people willing to accept laws rooted in fear, superstition, or the unquestioned power of monarchs. A new generation of thinkers began challenging every tradition that had shaped the medieval world, asking bold questions about human rights, fairness, and the proper limits of authority. Their ideas reshaped entire nations and laid the groundwork for what we now consider modern justice. What if the idea of justice we take for granted today was born from revolutionary thinkers who challenged centuries of tradition? At the heart of this movement were philosophers such as John Locke, whose writings on natural rights argued that every human being possessed inherent liberties, life, freedom, and property that no ruler could take away. Locke's insistence that governments existed to protect these rights, not violate them, challenged the core of medieval authority. If rulers could be held accountable to laws, then justice itself could no longer be the private tool of the powerful. It had to serve the people. Montesquieu expanded this idea by proposing one of the most influential concepts in modern political thought, the separation of powers. He believed that placing legislative, executive, and judicial power in the hands of a single authority led inevitably to tyranny. His remedy was elegant and revolutionary: divide power among branches of government so that no one person or institution could dominate. This principle reshaped legal systems across the Western world and remains the backbone of many modern constitutions. But no Enlightenment thinker left a deeper mark on criminal justice than Cesare Beccaria. His landmark work, On Crimes and Punishments, times 1764, condemned the cruelty that had defined the medieval age. Beccaria argued that torture was not only immoral but irrational, as it revealed pain tolerance rather than truth. He insisted that punishments should be proportionate, humane, and designed to prevent crime rather than inflict suffering. He even challenged the death penalty, an idea almost unthinkable in his time, claiming that execution served neither justice nor society. Beccaria shifted the global conversation from vengeance to rehabilitation, from brutality to reason. Their ideas spread rapidly across Europe and beyond. Courts began to abandon methods that had been accepted for centuries: trials by ordeal, public torture, and gruesome executions. Laws were rewritten to reflect fairness rather than fear. Rights to counsel, evidence-based trials, and protections against self-incrimination began to emerge, echoing Enlightenment ideals. For the first time, justice systems started to acknowledge the dignity of the individual, even the accused. This philosophical revolution did more than change laws; it reshaped the moral foundation of society. Justice was no longer defined by the power of rulers, but by principles of equality, restraint, and humanity. The Enlightenment didn't create a perfect system, but it breathed life into the notion that justice should evolve, improve, and be held accountable to reason. As these ideas took root, governments across Europe began adopting legal reforms that reflected this new spirit, paving the way for constitutional systems and the gradual abandonment of medieval punishments. The Age of Enlightenment had planted the seeds of modern justice, and now they were beginning to grow into something entirely new. The Enlightenment sparked a revolution not just in philosophy, but in the very structure of governance, and nowhere was that transformation more powerful than in the birth of constitutional law. For centuries, justice had been defined by the will of kings, the dictates of lords, and the rigid structures of medieval society. But as new ideas of liberty, equality, and natural rights took hold, people began to question whether authority should remain in the hands of a select few. Could revolutions based on liberty and equality really change how justice is defined forever? The answer emerged through the sweeping political upheavals at the end of the 18th century. The American Revolution marked one of the first moments when Enlightenment ideals were transformed into a functioning system of government. The creation of the United States Constitution established a radical new framework, one that limited governmental power, separated authority among branches, and enshrined the rule of law as superior to the whims of rulers. The Bill of Rights guaranteed protections medieval subjects could scarcely imagine: freedom of speech, protection from cruel and unusual punishment, and the right to a fair trial. These principles were not mere political choices. They were a rejection of centuries of arbitrary justice and a declaration that all individuals possessed inherent rights. Across the Atlantic, the French Revolution ignited an even more dramatic shift. Out of the turmoil and uncertainty came the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity as universal guarantees. It insisted that no one could be imprisoned without cause, that punishment must be proportionate, and that sovereignty belonged not to kings but to the people. For a society long shaped by monarchy and church authority, this was a seismic departure from tradition. The medieval world, with its feudal courts and divine right rulers, was being swept aside by the conviction that justice should serve citizens rather than control them. These revolutionary documents did more than inspire political change. They helped reshape the concept of human rights on a global scale. Ideas once considered radical became the foundation of modern justice: due process, equality before the law, and protection from arbitrary arrest. The lingering shadows of medieval brutality, torture, ordeal, forced confessions were increasingly recognized as violations of human dignity. As nations adopted constitutions and codified rights, justice became something that could be measured, defended, and universally applied. The transition from absolutism to constitutional order did not eliminate injustice, but it created systems designed to challenge and correct it. Courts grew more independent, legal protections expanded, and citizens gradually came to expect fairness as a fundamental part of life. The revolutions of the 18th century, fueled by Enlightenment ideals, turned justice from a tool of power into a promise of protection. With constitutional law and human rights established as cornerstones of the modern world, these principles began shaping legal systems far beyond their origins. Next, we explore how these revolutionary ideas moved from the pages of constitutions into daily practice, transforming the way modern societies administer justice and leaving medieval practices firmly in the past. The disappearance of torture and public executions from modern justice systems may seem inevitable to us now, but for centuries they were accepted and expected parts of legal punishment. Crowds gathered to witness death as spectacle, and torture was treated as a legitimate path to truth. Yet, within the span of only a few generations, these deeply entrenched practices began to crumble. What if centuries of brutal punishment and public executions were wiped away in a single generation? The answer lies in a powerful convergence of moral awakening, political upheaval, and changing public consciousness. The French Revolution became one of the earliest turning points. Though violent in its own right, it sparked debates that would help topple the old punitive structures. Revolutionary leaders questioned the legitimacy of cruelty as a tool of justice, arguing that punishment should be guided not by vengeance but by the rights of citizens. It was during this period that torture was first officially abolished in France, signaling a profound shift away from the medieval view that suffering could reveal truth or restore order. The guillotine, ironically invented as a humane alternative, became both a symbol of transformation and a reminder that even reform can be shaped by contradictions. Throughout the 19th century, the movement gathered momentum. Enlightenment ideas, combined with growing humanitarian sentiment, spread across Europe. Philosophers and reformers argued that a society's moral strength could be measured by how it treated its prisoners. Figures like John Howard, Elizabeth Fry, and Victor Hugo condemned the brutality of public executions and the cruelty of torture, insisting that such practices degraded both the punished and the spectators. Their work reshaped prisons, encouraged the development of rehabilitation programs, and pushed lawmakers to reconsider the purpose of punishment. At the same time, the public's appetite for violent spectacle began to wane. What once drew eager crowds started to feel barbaric, even shameful. Newspapers criticized the unruly carnival-like atmosphere of executions, arguing that they did little to deter crime and often had the opposite effect, normalizing violence rather than discouraging it. As industrialization and urbanization reshaped society, people began seeking order, efficiency, and dignity over chaotic public displays of death. Executions retreated from the town square into private chambers behind prison walls, and eventually, in many nations, disappeared altogether. By the 20th century, the abolition of torture had become a defining feature of modern justice. International agreements, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, and the European Convention on Human Rights, 1950, declared torture unacceptable under any circumstance. Nations that once relied on torture to extract confessions or intimidate populations now faced global condemnation for such acts. The shift was not just political, it was moral. Society came to understand that torture violated the fundamental dignity of human beings and corrupted the systems meant to protect them. The decline of public executions followed a similar arc. Countries gradually banned capital punishment entirely, and those that retained it limited its use and removed it from public view. The focus shifted from retribution to rehabilitation, with growing emphasis on the possibility of reform and reintegration into society. Justice began to be understood not as a demonstration of power, but as a means of maintaining fairness, safety, and humanity. This transformation marks one of the most profound moral evolutions in human history. What began as radical ideas championed by a handful of reformers eventually became the foundation of modern justice systems. With the end of torture and the fading of public executions, the world took a decisive step away from its medieval past. In the wake of this shift, new legal systems emerged, frameworks built on human rights, constitutional protections, and principles designed to safeguard individuals from the abuses that once defined medieval law. This leads us naturally into exploring the modern systems of justice that grew from these reforms, ensuring fairness and protection remain at the heart of the law. Even as modern justice systems present themselves as rational, humane, and fair, their foundations remain deeply rooted in a world shaped centuries ago. The brutality of medieval justice may be gone, yet its architecture, its structure, its assumptions, its core ideas still lingers in the systems we rely on today. What if the justice system we rely on today is still haunted by the practices of the medieval past? Look closely enough, and you begin to see the traces everywhere. One of the most enduring legacies is the trial by jury. Originating in medieval England as a rough assemblage of local townsfolk who knew the accused, juries were once far from impartial. They were neighbours, rivals, even witnesses. Yet the concept that ordinary people should weigh evidence and decide a person's fate became a revolutionary safeguard against unchecked power. Over centuries, that idea evolved into the modern jury system we know today, where jurors are meant to embody fairness rather than familiarity. Though transformed, the medieval heartbeat is still there. Justice, in part, belongs to the people. Another medieval inheritance is the use of legal precedents. The common law system, developed under medieval monarchs seeking uniformity across their realms, established the idea that past rulings should guide future ones. What began as a practical solution to inconsistent feudal judgments became a defining feature of modern legal reasoning. Courts today still look backward to move forward, citing decisions made decades or even centuries ago. This continuity offers stability, but it also binds modern law to its ancient roots, reminding us that the past is never fully gone. Even the mundane act of legal documentation carries a medieval signature. In a time when disputes were recorded by scribes using careful script on parchment, the idea emerged that the written word held power, that law, once recorded, could outlast any ruler. This belief eventually shaped everything from property records to constitutions. Today, entire legal systems depend on written documentation, contracts, case files, codified laws. The medieval world taught us that justice must be preserved not in memory, but in writing. Yet these inherited structures carry shadows. The medieval emphasis on hierarchy and authority can still be felt in modern systems, where access to justice is often uneven. Wealth, influence, and social position factors that shaped medieval trials continue to shape outcomes today. We no longer face trial by ordeal, but inequalities remain, echoing the old divisions between lords and commoners. In some cases, The complexity of legal systems reflects a lineage that once kept ordinary people at a distance, speaking a language only the powerful could understand. Despite these remnants, the transformation has been profound. What emerged from medieval foundations is a system that aspires toward fairness, even if imperfectly. The journey from torture chambers and feudal courts to modern judicial halls is long and twisting, but it shows how deeply our present is intertwined with our past. From these traces of medieval justice in our modern world, we move toward a deeper reflection on how these ancient systems shaped not only our laws, but our moral understanding of fairness, equality, and the human desire to seek justice across time. The moral legacy of medieval justice lingers not only in our legal institutions, but in the way we think about crime, punishment, and fairness. Though centuries have passed since ordeals by fire, gallows in the town square, and confessions extracted through agony, the ethical framework born from that era continues to shape modern debates. How have centuries-old ideas about justice shaped how we view crime, punishment, and human rights today? The answer lies in the long conversation between past brutality and the conscience that eventually rose to challenge it. In the medieval world, justice was intertwined with divine will. Punishment was often seen as a spiritual reckoning, God's judgment rendered through human hands. Pain and suffering were believed to cleanse wrongdoing, making torture or execution not only acceptable, but morally justified. This worldview created a moral landscape where cruelty was equated with righteousness. Even today, echoes of this thinking surface when societies debate punitive approaches to crime, especially in arguments that harsh punishment deters wrongdoing or restores moral balance. As the centuries progressed, these ideas collided with emerging notions of human dignity. Philosophers of the Enlightenment challenged the belief that suffering was a path to truth, arguing instead that justice should protect life, not extinguish it. Their ideas reshaped moral expectations. Torture became universally condemned, and capital punishment increasingly questioned. Yet the medieval view of punishment as moral cleansing still surfaces in modern rhetoric, particularly in debates over the death penalty, solitary confinement, and mandatory sentencing. The struggle between retribution and rehabilitation is, at its heart, a struggle between medieval and modern moralities. Fairness in trials also carries a moral legacy. In medieval courts, guilt was often assumed unless disproven, and confession coerced or genuine stood as the ultimate proof. Today, the presumption of innocence is a cornerstone of justice systems, but the psychological shadow of medieval suspicion remains. Public reaction to high-profile cases often reflects an instinct to assign guilt quickly, a faint but persistent echo of the days when reputation or rumor could seal one's fate. Modern societies still wrestle with the tension between due process and the emotional need for closure, a conflict rooted in ancient notions of punishment and honor. We also inherit a complex relationship with human rights. Medieval justice rarely acknowledged individual rights beyond one's social status. Today, rights are central to legal systems, yet their application remains uneven, especially for the marginalized. This inequality can be traced back to medieval hierarchies that valued some lives more than others. Our ongoing struggle to create systems that uphold dignity for all reflects a moral evolution still in progress. Ultimately, the moral legacy of medieval justice lies not in the practices we left behind, but in the ethical transformation they forced upon us. By confronting the darkness of the past, societies forged new ideals: fairness, humanity, restraint. Each modern debate about punishment or rights is shaped by the memory of what once was, an ongoing reminder that justice is not a fixed destination but a journey shaped by centuries of trial, error, and awakening. As we conclude this philosophical reflection, we move toward a final section that brings the entire journey together, tracing the evolution from medieval tyranny to our modern pursuit of fairness and justice. Justice has never been a fixed idea. It shifts with our fears, our hopes, and the world we build around ourselves. As we move deeper into the 21st century, we find ourselves standing on the edge of profound change. New tools, new threats, and new ideals are reshaping the very foundations of how laws are written, enforced, and understood. What will justice look like in the future, and will we learn from the dark chapters of our past? The answer depends on how well we carry forward the lessons carved into history by centuries of struggle. Today, we face challenges medieval lawmakers could never have imagined. Technology has transformed nearly every aspect of human life, creating questions about privacy, surveillance, digital crime, and the limits of state power. Artificial intelligence can both protect and endanger rights, offering tools to analyze evidence while also raising fears of bias and control. As governments gain unprecedented access to information about their citizens, modern societies must decide whether justice will remain grounded in human dignity or drift towards systems that value efficiency over compassion. The echoes of the past remind us that unchecked power, no matter how advanced its tools, can easily lead us backward. Globalization brings its own set of dilemmas. Borders blur, cultures collide, and justice can no longer be contained within a single nation. International courts, human rights treaties, and global watchdogs attempt to hold powerful actors accountable, yet inequalities persist between countries, just as they once did between medieval classes. Some nations advance human rights, while others retreat into authoritarian models that mirror the very systems humanity once fought to escape. As our world becomes increasingly interconnected, justice must evolve to protect people across diverse cultures and political landscapes. At the same time, new movements are reshaping our understanding of punishment. Restorative justice, a practice centered on healing rather than retribution, is gaining ground. It challenges the centuries-old belief that punishment must involve suffering. Instead, it seeks to repair harm, encourage accountability, and rebuild relationships. Many legal systems are also embracing rehabilitation, recognizing that people can change when given guidance rather than fear. This shift reflects a growing desire to break the cycles of violence and inequality inherited from medieval practices. Human rights remain the guiding star of modern justice, yet even they are constantly tested. Debates surrounding policing, incarceration, and the rights of marginalized communities reveal that fairness is still elusive. These struggles are reminders that progress is fragile and that justice, if not actively defended, can slip back toward inequality and control. The medieval past warns us how easily fear can shape law, how quickly societies can justify cruelty, and how vital it is to question systems rather than accept them blindly. Looking forward, the future of justice depends on whether we choose to honor the lessons carved into history. Will we build systems that value empathy, fairness, and accountability? Or will new pressures push us back toward harsher, more primitive instincts? The path we choose will determine not only the laws we live by, but the kind of world we leave for those who follow. This final reflection closes the journey, reminding us that justice is not inherited. It is created, shaped, and protected by each generation, determined to rise above the shadows of the past. The story of medieval justice is often told as though it belongs to a distant age, an era of darkness, brutality, and superstition that modern society has long since overcome. Yet as we've followed its winding path through centuries of courts, codes, reforms, and revolutions, a deeper truth emerges. Medieval justice is not gone. It is woven into the very foundations of the systems we rely on today. What if the story of medieval justice is not just a chapter of the past, but a lesson for the future? Throughout this journey, we've seen how ideas born in the medieval world continue to shape our understanding of fairness and authority. Trial by jury, the use of legal precedent, the importance of written law. These were carved out of an age defined by uncertainty and fear. They arose not because the medieval world was enlightened, but because people living in the shadows of harsh punishments and arbitrary rule sought something better. Their solutions were imperfect, often tangled in the very systems they tried to reform, yet they became the starting points for modern justice. We've also confronted the darker legacies, the echoes of inequality, the remnants of hierarchy, the instinct to punish harshly in moments of fear. Though torture has been outlawed and public executions have disappeared, the impulse behind them, the belief that power must be displayed to maintain order, still surfaces in modern debates. The medieval world reminds us how easily justice can be twisted by fear, superstition, or authority. It challenges us to recognize that progress is fragile and that fairness must be defended, not assumed. Our exploration of the Renaissance and Enlightenment showed how new ideas slowly chipped away at medieval cruelty. Philosophers questioned the necessity of suffering, revolutionaries wrote rights into constitutions, and reformers exposed the moral cost of punishment. Yet even these waves of change carried medieval shadows. The struggle to balance authority and liberty, punishment and rehabilitation, order and compassion, these conflicts are not new. They are centuries old, resurfacing again and again in different forms as societies evolve. Today, as we face unprecedented challenges, technological change, global migration, new forms of crime, and shifting social values, the same fundamental question remains: what does it mean to deliver justice? The medieval world, harsh as it was, offers a powerful reminder that justice can either lift a society or break it. It can be used to protect the vulnerable or to control them. It can reveal our highest ideals or our darkest instincts. The journey from medieval tyranny to modern reform is not a straight line, nor is it complete. It is a long arc shaped by human struggle, shaped by our capacity for cruelty and our longing for fairness. As we look toward the future, the lessons of the medieval past call out with quiet urgency. Remember where justice began, remember what it has destroyed and what it has built, and let its history guide us towards something better. The story does not end here. It continues in every courtroom, every legal debate, every conversation about rights, fairness, and accountability. Medieval justice may belong to the past, but its influence endures, warning, guiding, and reminding us that the pursuit of justice is one of humanity's oldest, hardest, and most important journeys.